A very warm welcome, all of you who have joined in for this session. I'm Dr. Shweta Shirore, representing Global Insurance Brokers, and we are here for the session on healthcare for elderly. I'm happy to have Dr. Ayush Bhatia as a speaker here for this session. Dr. Ayush is a lifestyle doctor, a homeopath, a bachelor practitioner, acupuncturist, wellness coach, and being a gold medalist, he has been practicing classical homeopathy for more than 2 decades now. And he has also served in the tertiary super specialty teaching hospitals, where he had worked upon integrating the modern medicine and diagnostics with the principle of complementary medicine. So without much of his time, I would like to hand over the session to Dr. Ayush, who will be taking us not only about the what to look out for as a healthcare for elderly, but also a few of the takeaways where you would have something to work upon what he actually wants to mention here. If you have any question during the session, please put them in the chat box. While putting in the chat box, please address it to all panelists so that your queries are not missed out. We would address all your queries at the end of the session. Over to you, Dr. Ayush.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shweta, and namaste and good evening, rather good afternoon, everyone, on this session on healthcare for the elderly. So this is a very broad topic, but I've tried to, I'll probably limit it to probably 2 or 3 conditions specifically, which are more common as we grow older. So we'll talk about, probably we'll bring about an awareness to metabolic disorders where we'll focus specifically on diabetes and hypertension. We'll talk about some common signs and symptoms that we should be aware of. We should be aware of the risk factors as well and the complications that are associated with this condition. We'll then discuss certain lifestyle and diet recommendations. I'll probably touch base upon some herbal remedies as well. And I'm going to demonstrate certain acupressure points which help in the metabolic process of the body. And in that way, it helps to manage sugar levels as well. We'll then talk about high blood pressure. Why is it called the silent killer? We'll talk about its causes and symptoms. And we'll then discuss generic lifestyle tools to manage high blood pressure. And we'll again discuss some acupressure points once again. And we are going to wrap up the session with a very brief talk on keeping our brain healthy, keeping our brain healthy, delaying the onset of degenerative conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's, how best we can do it by focusing on certain well-being principles. Now, just to ensure that, the presentation goes seamlessly, I would turn my video off so that you can all focus upon the PowerPoint that I've prepared for you. Whenever I do some demonstrations, I'm going to come back again on video. So we'll just take the session forward now, and we'll start with a very, very big topic, which is diabetes. Now, what exactly is diabetes? Probably if I go by the definition, this is a group of diseases that affect how the body uses blood sugar, which is glucose. Now, glucose is very vital for our health because it is an important source of energy. And it is a source of energy for the cells that make up the muscles, the tissues. It is also our main source of energy or fuel to the brain as well. So in normal circumstances, there is a sugar metabolism which takes place. So there's a release of insulin by the healthy cells in the pancreas, which help in the glucose metabolism. But in some cases, there is a failure wherein the pancreas, the specialized cells, they are unable to produce insulin, which leads to glucose overload, and the glucose does not enter the cells and it is present in the bloodstream, which is termed as type 1 diabetes. And in some cases, there is, there's a concern with the absorption of glucose into the cells, but the insulin production does happen, and the cell does not respond properly to insulin, and the insulin receptors are not working properly in the cells, which again leads to sugar overload in the blood sugar levels, which is termed as type 2 diabetes. Now, pre-diabetes is another condition when the blood sugar levels are high. They're normal, but not enough for the medical practitioner to diagnose you with diabetes. So this is termed as impaired glucose tolerance, wherein the glucose tolerance has gone down. Now, if you look at the statistical data, most of the cases that we come across are of type 2 diabetes or non-insulin dependent diabetes. About 10% of the cases are type 1 diabetes, wherein the body does not produce any insulin. And type 2 diabetes can definitely be prevented. It can be controlled as well. In cases of type 1 diabetes, obviously you have to have medicines. Now, there's another type of diabetes which is seen in pregnant females, which is termed as gestational diabetes, wherein during pregnancy, due to changes in the hormonal levels, blood sugar levels can shoot up. But usually post-delivery, the condition reverses. But yes, if a female has had gestational diabetes, there is a higher risk of her developing type 2 diabetes as she grows older. So there are certain preventive measures mentioned out here, but yes, we're going to talk about that in great detail in the coming slides. Now, why have I chosen diabetes as a topic for the elderly? It's simple because this usually affects once we cross the age of 45, 50, 55. So depending upon our genes, depending upon our lifestyle, yes, diabetes can happen earlier as well. It can happen in the 30s, also in the 20s as well. But usually speaking, it usually happens after middle age. And usually 50, 55 and above is the usual age after which it may start. And in some people in the late 60s and 70s also. Now, if I talk about the causative factors of diabetes, if I talk about, before I move on to this slide, I'll just quickly talk about the causative factors. Now, the exact cause of type 1 diabetes is not known, which is the insulin dependent. But what is known is that the immune system, which normally fights harmful bacteria or viruses, it attacks and destroys the insulin producing cells present in the pancreas. And this leaves us with little or no insulin. So instead of being transported into the cell, the sugar builds up in the bloodstream. Now, type 1 is thought to be a causation or caused by a combination of genetic susceptibility and environmental factors, though exactly what those factors are is still unclear. Now, usually weight gain is not believed to be a factor for type 1 diabetes, but it is a very, very important factor in type 2 diabetes. What happens in type 2 diabetes, which is the body does not make or use insulin well. Though the insulin is being produced, but the body does not use it well. And you can develop type 2 diabetes at any age, as I mentioned, but it is more common in older adults, wherein type 1 is more common in children and even teenagers. Now, people with type 2 diabetes may still have enough insulin in their bodies, but they do not have enough proper blood sugar management. Now, again, in pre-diabetes, again, which can lead to type 2 diabetes, the cells become resistant to the action of insulin, and the pancreas is unable to make enough insulin to overcome the resistance. So instead of moving into the cells where it is needed for energy, the sugar builds up in the bloodstream. Now, type 2 diabetes is also known as insulin-resistant diabetes, which is an older term. And a still older term used was adult onset diabetes, because usually more of adults would suffer from it. But it should be considered a carbohydrate sugar intolerance, actually. That is why it happens. Now, if I talk about, the condition in which the body becomes ineffective in utilizing sugar as an energy source, which basically means that there's a lot of depletion which is happening as far as energy is concerned. So in fact, eating carbohydrates causes a cascade of metabolic effects that include the storage of fat and the inability to burn fat as an energy. So though a person is eating carbohydrates, it is not getting converted into energy. So this increase in fat is what contributes to the insulin resistance. And the insulin becomes ineffective at lowering the blood sugar, but it still works very well at storing and locking down fat. So the fat is being locked down, but the insulin is not effective in lowering the blood sugar levels. So now, if such things keep on continuing, we kind of start developing symptoms. Some of the common symptoms that we associate with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes would be an increased thirst, which is called polydipsia. There is increased urination or increased frequency to pass urine, polyuria. There's extreme hunger as well. A person feels, great hunger pangs even after eating proper meals. There is unexplained weight loss. The person, though eating very well, will still lose muscle mass and weight loss. Now, there could be presence of ketones in the urine, which is a byproduct of the breakdown of muscle and fat that happens when there is not enough available insulin. So, when you do some certain tests, if a urine test is done, so ketone bodies will be found in the urine, which is again a telltale sign that the person may be suffering from diabetes. Obviously, there is excessive tiredness and fatigue because you're not getting energy. There could be mental irritability as well because of the tiredness. There could be blurry vision because vision does get affected in diabetes. The skin healing mechanism gets affected. So any kind of skin lesions, any kind of wounds would take time to heal. There could be frequent infections, such as in the mouth or the oral cavity, or in the skin, or in the private areas. And usually there is a lack of interest in concentration. And there also in later stages could be numbness in the hands or the feet, which is termed as polyneuropathy. So these are some common symptoms that we should be aware of. And specifically, if we find such alarming symptoms in ourselves or in our family members, then there's time to go to and visit a medical practitioner and get this sorted. Now, if we talk about risk factors which are associated with diabetes, some are very, very classical. Lack of physical activity or physical inactivity is one such cause. So the less active you are, the greater your risk, because physical activity helps you to control your weight. It uses up glucose as energy and makes your cells more sensitive to insulin. Whereas if you're inactive, there's generally weight gain, and usually there is truncal fat or fat around the abdomen, which increases insulin resistance as well. Now, if you talk about other factors, it could run in families as well. There are certain ethnic populations which may be more at risk of developing diabetes. So race or ethnicity plays a role out here. Weight plays a role. So the more the fatty tissue you have, the more resistant your cells become to insulin. Similarly, if you talk about other factors, age, your risk increases as you grow older. So this may be because you tend to exercise less, you lose muscle mass, and you gain weight as you grow older. But type 2 diabetes is also increasing among children, adolescents, and younger adults, which is a cause of concern and which directly points towards the lifestyle that we are heading. So the younger children, they are more they're more susceptible to kind of having a sedentary lifestyle. There's a lot of comfort eating happening, a lot of packed food, packaged food, which is easily available, which is full of preservatives. So the nutritional content is coming down, and all these are great contributing factors in increasing the occurrence of diabetes even in the younger population. Now, in females specifically, if there has been a history of gestational diabetes, then the lady is at a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes as she grows older. Similarly, a female who has polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is another common condition, which is characterized by irregular menstrual periods, excessive hair growth in the body parts, is again prone to developing diabetes. Now, having a high blood pressure also plays a role out here. So having a blood pressure which is systolic and diastolic 140/90 and above, it is again linked to increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Now, abnormal cholesterol and triglyceride levels. So if you have low levels of high density lipoprotein, which is called the HDL or the good cholesterol, your risk of type 2 diabetes is higher. Similarly, triglycerides are another type of fat carried in the blood. So people with high levels of triglycerides again have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So these are again important measures which tell us whether a person would be susceptible to diabetes or not. Now, why is diabetes so important? Because if you look at the complications that are associated with diabetes, you will see that there is hardly any system which is not affected. So diabetes has an impact on your cardiovascular system. So there could be there could be formation of plaques as well, because diabetes may be associated with deposits of plaques forming and atherosclerotic conditions developing, which is deposit of plaques in the arteries, which may impede the blood circulation, which may eventually lead to cardiac complications also. If it affects the arteries supplying the brain, there could be a risk of hemorrhage and brain stroke developing. Uh, Again, the diabetic complications affect the blood vessels in the entire body. So again, you may have a condition wherein you may develop peripheral neuropathy, wherein the nerve endings are also get affected, which supply nerves to your distal parts like your hands and your feet. The kidneys may get affected. The kidney blood circulation may get affected, which is again a complication which leads to chronic kidney disease as well, and diabetic nephropathy may develop. Similarly, the skin may get affected, or the circulation may affect the skin condition, and a diabetic foot, which is a very common complication in diabetes, wherein because of lack of sensation at times, because lack of blood circulation, there is poor healing of any kind of open wound which may develop in the lower extremities. And in such cases, again, there would be poor healing ulcers. There would be skin wounds which will not respond to treatment very easily. Now, again, the eyes also get affected very easily because the eyes are again supplied by minute blood vessels. So once the blood vessels all over the body get affected, so would the eyes. And this can lead to intraocular raise in pressure, leading to a condition called glaucoma. There could be development of cataracts, and there could be diabetic retinopathy developing with the optic nerve getting affected. So diabetes, if not controlled, can lead to multiple problems, which may affect one's quality of life in a very direct manner. Now, obviously, we know most of us who have this condition, they kind of depend on medicines. They pop in the pills, and there are different stages of medicines that are needed. So if you go to a modern medicine practitioner, obviously you'll be put on medicines, and then depending upon the amount of control that you have and the amount of symptoms that you have, your dosage will be moderated, and there will be different salts that will be used. So I'm not going into that because that is not my specialty. But I'm here to talk about what we can do from a healthy lifestyle perspective that can help us to increase the odds of beating type 2 diabetes, or increasing the odds of postponing the onset of diabetes and keeping us healthy over a longer period of time. So even if you have had this condition developed, if you still focus upon a very healthy lifestyle, you will definitely be able to control it much better, and your dependency on medicines would reduce. Long-term usage of medicines do have their own complications, which can impact your overall health and well-being also. So instead of focusing only on medications, we can look at focusing on developing certain healthy routines. So developing an exercise routine is highly recommended. So physical activity is a very important part of managing your blood glucose levels. So one should ideally perform at least 30 minutes of physical activity that increases the heart rate, and this should be done at least 5 to 6 times in a week. So if you can devote about 20 to 30 minutes on a daily basis to brisk cardio-based activity, that would be highly recommended for you. So now, not everyone is a gym person. But you can look at different activities that appeal to you. Some people would like to cycle. Some people would like to do a brisk walk. Some people would love to indulge in any kind of a sport, which may be played only for 10 to 15 minutes, like a game of badminton, or probably maybe a swim for that matter. So it all depends upon what your basic interests or inclinations are. And obviously, if you can do a couple of days of strength training as well, that would also be nice for your muscle mass, because in diabetes, you tend to lose your muscle mass as well. Now, losing the excess weight is quite important, and it is mentioned that even if you're overweight, for example, and if you're able to lose even 7% of your body weight, then you reduce the risk of developing diabetes significantly. Motivating yourself is very important, because both physical activity and keeping yourself fit and managing to lose weight needs a lot of motivation and focus. So start with small baby steps. Start with maybe 10 to 15-minute daily practices of physical activity. And once that becomes ingrained into your daily lifestyle, then look at increasing it to 20 minutes or 30 minutes, whichever is more comfortable for you. from a sleep perspective, getting at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep is recommended. Now, sleep can affect your blood sugar levels, and your blood glucose control can also affect your sleep, which results in trouble sleeping at times. So in cases you have concerns with sleep, following a good sleep hygiene is important, which basically means maintaining a regular circadian rhythm, which basically means having a proper sleep and wake up time. So that is a good way to tell your nervous system when to switch off. So people who have a regular sleep and wake up time have a better control over their circadian rhythm or biorhythm. Similarly, people who eat meals at regular times instead of being erratic, again, have a better control over their circadian rhythm and do not develop sleep concerns because of that. Now, getting ambient sleep environment is again important to ensure that your sleep quality is good. Now, when we talk about good sleep hygiene, we also talk about the importance of decompression time, which simply put is a time frame at least 1.5 hours before bedtime, wherein you are not doing anything which is mentally very stimulating. So mental stimulation can happen at multiple levels. It could be being glued to the social media, exchanging information on social media, being engaged in deep-seated conversations on social media, uh, then kind of maybe watching some programs on television, which could be again mentally stimulating, answering to your emails, being glued to your cell phone, being exposed to blue light radiation. So all these can impact your sleep significantly. So ensuring that if your cutoff time to sleep is 10:30, then 8:30 is a good time to switch off from all these mentally stimulating activities. And this is a part of your decompression routine. And within this decompression routine, you can look at doing something to probably quieten your mind also. Maybe a 5 to 7 minute breathing exercise would again be highly recommended, which again improves your sleep patterns. Saying no to caffeine or to coffee in the evenings is recommended again, because coffee intake in the evenings can impact your sleep cycle. Similarly, doing something which is very, very physically strenuous in the evenings, like some people, they like to go to the gym in the evening hours. Not a great thing to do, because if you do something which is physically very stimulating, that can impact your sleep by increasing the level of cortisol, by increasing the level of adrenaline, and this will keep you awake at night. And again, poor sleep will have an impact on your blood sugar levels as well. Apart from sleep, we can also talk about being regular with your tests and checkups, because if any problem is spotted early, you can look at avoiding potential complications from developing. Another thing that I would like to add, which I missed out when I was talking about sleep, is the ambient room temperature, which should be between 22 to 24 degrees, and minimal lighting in your bedroom, so that the amount of melatonin, which is usually produced in the evenings, does not get impacted. Now, managing mental chatter, managing stress is important. So normal tools, because stress hormones have a very, very direct impact on your glucose levels, causing it to rise significantly. Stress management is important, and you could incorporate, different practices. It could be meditation, it could be a bit of pranayama, it could be journaling. So whatever you feel more comfortable penning down your thoughts, every day in the evenings can be a good way of releasing any kind of pent up emotions, or people who have a lot of holding patterns in them, who are not very happy to kind of express their thoughts. So that is a good way of letting out your emotions and controlling your thoughts as well. You see, all these things are quite related if we talk about lifestyle recommendations, because these things go a long way in ensuring that you're able to maintain a healthy lifestyle and control your normal parameters as well. Now, smoking is another parameter that has to be brought down or controlled or quit if possible, because smoking has a direct impact on the blood vessels again. It causes deposition of plaques, and once your blood vessels get affected, complications of diabetes become much more common. Now, moving forward, I'll quickly talk about some very specific remedies out here, which we use in complementary therapy. Now, when I talk about these remedies, I would also want to add that I would not be asking you to buy them over the counter and take them. because they may have the dosage, the potency, all this needs to be assessed before you take any remedy. So whether even if it is a herbal remedy, it can have its own side effects at times. So ensure that you speak to a medical professional and then only take these medicines. But this is just a way to tell you that there are certain remedies which work wonderfully well by working on the mental and emotional sphere of a person, and provides great relief also. So the first remedy is Syzygium jambolenum, which is made from jamun. Now, this remedy has an immediate effect on the increased blood sugar levels. If there's a sudden spike, taking Syzygium over a period of time can help bring down the spikes in a much more, comprehensive manner. So the most common, this is one of the most common remedies that we use actually. So usually the symptoms that are associated with this medicine would include a kind of a prickly heat rash in the upper part of the body with intense itching and small eruptions, and there's a constant urge to urinate with increased thirst and great emaciation, which is loss of flesh basically. So this remedy is indicated in diabetics who have developed diabetic skin ulcers also. So it is a good remedy for ulcer healing as well. The second remedy that I'll talk about is called Helonius, which is again a plant extract. So this is indicated in diabetics who suffer from frequent urination again, and the color of the urine is usually whitish, which basically means that the person is passing protein or albumin in the urine. So on a mental sphere again, these people usually have a weakness of memory. They are extremely melancholic in nature, and they can become irritated with slightest of contradictions. So these are the symptoms on which we kind of select when we are selecting a remedy. Cephalandra indica has been proved to be very effective in lowering and maintaining the blood sugar levels, and it is also indicated in people who suffer from an intolerable burning pain all over the body with profuse urination. Again, skin symptoms are important in cephalandra, wherein a person may have diabetes related carbuncles forming in the skin, diabetes related abscess, which is not healing. So in such cases also this remedy can be quite beneficial. And probably the last remedy that I'll talk about is called uranium nitricum, which works very well when an individual suffers from diabetes and has gastric concerns associated with it. So again, there's an increased appetite, there's excessive thirst, they may be associated nausea and vomiting with a burning in the pit of the stomach, and the person may be prone to gastric ulcers also. And the person, because of these complications, may develop a tendency to fluid accumulation in the abdominal cavity, cholecystitis. So this remedy is then a good remedy of choice when we kind of look at alternatives in herbal medicine or homeopathy. Now, another very important aspect of controlling diabetes is your diet. Please understand that you can still enjoy your sugar, but ensure that you eat it in a judicious manner. So instead of eating sugar separately or any kind of sweet separately, it should be part of the greater meal that you're having, which basically means that after the end of a meal, you can take a small, sweet as a treat, because then the spike in the sugar levels will not happen. But if you are having a piece of sweet separately, at any other given point in time, there could be a sudden spike in your sugar levels. So that is important. So again, carbohydrates, there's no, you're not supposed to avoid carbohydrates, but you can look at taking complex carbs so that they break down slowly and sugar overload does not happen. So different types of complex carbs are available, whether it is millet, whether it is amaranth, whether it is quinoa. So you can replace refined wheat and refined flour with complex grains, which do not cause any sugar spike to happen suddenly. Similarly, when you talk about vegetables and proteins are also indicated. You need to take your proteins as well. And you also need to take, starchy and non-starchy carbs that we just talked about. So starchy carbs are potatoes, which can be taken in moderation. And you could take a list of non-starchy carbs. So different examples would be, asparagus, baby corn, beets, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. So these are all examples of non-starchy vegetables that you could eat. Again, from the perspective of healthy oils and healthy fats. So healthy fats from nuts, from fish oil, flax seeds, olive oil, mustard oil for that matter. All these are healthy oils that you can take. Avoid saturated fats and trans fats. Avoid red meat if possible, because this can have an impact on you. But having having chicken, or if you're a non-vegetarian, having an egg white is also fine, but avoid having the yolk. Fruits and vegetables should ideally be fresh. The more colorful, the better. And you should look at having whole fruit instead of having fruit juices. Now, fruits again, there are certain fruits which you could look at having in moderation. Fruits which are very sweet in nature, like chiku, for example. Mangoes again should be in moderation, but you can always have a mango. But chiku should be in great moderation. Otherwise, citrus fruits are perfectly fine for you. Jamun as a fruit, as and when it is available in the summer months, is again a wonderful fruit to have. You could look at having, not an overripe banana, but just ripe banana is okay for you. But an overripe banana, it should be avoided. You can have guavas, but again, the idea is to have fruits. Apples are also fine. You could have stewed apple as well. But again, the idea is to not to go for exotic fruits, but go for fruits which are in the season. So have seasonal fruit products which are then better absorbed by the body. Decrease the intake of trans fat, which I just mentioned, or which is available in hydrogenated or deep fried foods. Again, packaged foods and fast foods, especially those high in sugar, baked goods, sweets, chips, desserts, should again be avoided. Processed meat and red meat should be avoided again because of its obvious impact on your sugar levels. Alcohol, if any, should be taken only in moderation, because it is easy to underestimate the carbs and the calories that alcoholic drinks pump into your body. So again, it is important that if you like your drink, you should drink in great moderation. Now moving on, we'll now talk about certain acupressure points. Like I had mentioned, before I talk about acupressure points, I would just want to tell you that when we talk in terms of alternative therapy, so whether it is Ayurveda, whether it is homeopathy, whether it is Chinese medicine, we put a lot of focus and emphasis on the process of energy healing. So in Ayurveda, we term it as the prana or the ojas. So the various treatments that are incorporated, the medicines, they also work on the energy sphere. Similarly, in homeopathy, we term it as the vital force or the life force, and the purpose of the medicine is to stimulate the vital force. Similarly, in Chinese medicine, acupressure is derived from the principles of Chinese medicine. It is the flow of energy which is basically being stimulated. So when this flow of energy gets blocked due to various reasons, it could be physical factors, it could be emotional factors, symptoms start to develop. Now, when I talk about diabetes, I am talking in terms of a metabolic disorder, wherein the focus of these pressure points is to focus upon the different internal organs and their energy system. So the entire body has an energy meridian system inside, and these specific points are called the meridian or energy points. They are named after the different internal organs. So we have a heart meridian, we have a lung meridian, we have a kidney meridian, we have a large intestine meridian, we have a small intestine meridian, we have a stomach meridian, so on and so forth. So when we stimulate these points, so either we are focusing upon reducing the inflammation in the body, because there's a very specific point that I'm going to talk about, which is an anti-inflammatory point. Then there is a point which helps to improve the process of digestion by working on the stomach energy. And it is a great point for physical fatigue as well, because of lack of assimilation of food. The third point that I'll talk about falls on the liver meridian. So it is a good point for mental agitation. And the fourth point that you see behind the knee point is the bladder 40 point, which again works on the urinary system, which helps in the removal of toxins from the body. And all these have a significant role to play in your metabolism. So some of the points I'll be able to demonstrate, but most of the points are present in the lower part of the body. And probably I will not be able to stand up and show it to you. But I'm going to still talk about the points, and you'll have to refer to the picture, as you can see. So the first point is called below the knee point. I have specifically mentioned the name of the body point for ease of remembrance, because if I say simulate your stomach 36 point, you may not be able to recollect or remember what is the stomach 36 point. So below the knee point is usually measured about 4-finger breadths below the patella or the kneecap. So if I have to measure the point on my right knee, I will use my left hand fingers and place them at the level of the patella or the kneecap, the way it is being shown in the picture. And wherein my little finger falls, if you look at your little finger, wherein it touches the front of your leg or the upper part of your leg, is the location of that particular point. So once you've located the point, use your thumb or your index finger and apply deep pressure on that particular area. And you could, while applying pressure, you could just gently rotate the area for 30 to 45 seconds. So every point that is stimulated, you should stimulate it for 30 to 45 seconds, and that is good enough. And there are 2 points for every 1 point. That means there is a mirror point also. So if there is a stomach 36 point or below the knee point on my right knee, below my right knee, there is a similar point or below my left knee also. So I will be stimulating both the points, and then I will move on to the next point, which is present in my hands. Now this falls on the large intestine meridian, but that apart, the hand point is the anti-inflammatory point in acupressure. That means it helps to reduce inflammation in the body. So this point is present actually between your thumb and your index finger. So the index finger and the thumb, so these are the two fingers that we need to focus upon. So as I bring my thumb closer to my index finger, you will see that my muscle out here becomes more prominent. So I'm taking my thumb apart. As I bring it closer, the muscle becomes more prominent. So this point is right at the center of that prominence. And this is how we locate the point. And then we apply specific pressure on both the sides of on the palmar area and on the thumb area as well, and apply the pressure systematically for about 30 to 45 seconds. Now, in some people, this point can be tender and painful. As I said, it signifies the amount of inflammation in the body. So this point is also a very good point for neck tightness, which may be associated with emotional holding patterns, or it may be associated with any kind of cervical degeneration that may be happening. Neck tightness may also develop if you're working long hours in front of the computer. So this also releases the neck tightness and neck muscles. This is also a very good point for headaches of any kind. So if you're suffering from headaches, stimulating the point for about 30 to 45 seconds can reduce the intensity of pains within a few minutes. So once I've stimulated the point on my left hand, I will move to my right hand and similarly locate the point and stimulate it. Now the third point is called the foot point or the liver 3 point, which again is a very good point for mental agitation. It is again a good point for bringing the blood pressure down if it is shot up due to mental irritation or anger. So basically it works on the liver meridian. Liver is a very, very important organ because it helps to detoxify the body. So whatever toxins build up, it is the liver which kind of removes it from the system. So this basically helps to improve the liver energy meridian. So this point is present between the great toe and the second toe. So you have to imagine that this is my foot, dorsum of my foot. If this is the great toe and this is the second toe, this is called the webbing of the toe, wherein the two toes meet. Now this specific point is about 2 finger breadths from the webbing of the toe. So you will place 2 fingers at the webbing of your toe, and where your second finger ends is the location of the point as seen in the picture. And this point usually falls within a hollow groove within the tendons. So you have to gently stimulate the point again for 30 to 45 seconds. So this can be a regular feature which you can kind of incorporate, because it will always help to improve your metabolic processes in the body and improve the functioning of the internal organs, the vital ones. So you can make it a small habit of stimulating these points, a couple of times in a day, and invest about 3 to 4 minutes in the entire procedure or process. Now the last point is present behind the knee. So behind the knee, there is a place called the popliteal fossa. That area is called the popliteal fossa. So we have the bladder 40 point, and this is right in between the in the popliteal fossa behind the knee area. So you can look at the picture and then you can try and stimulate the point again for 30 to 45 seconds at the most, or probably up to 1 minute. Now moving on, we'll move on to the next slide. Now we'll talk about the importance of maintaining a proper blood pressure. So again, we will quickly understand that blood pressure is something which is again not very age specific. It can happen early on as well, but in most cases, the rise in blood pressure usually happens after a certain age. So this is because the blood vessels they start to lose elasticity as well. So this is again an age-related complication which usually happens once we enter into once we are beyond middle age and beyond that. but it can also happen earlier depending upon our lifestyle. So what exactly is blood pressure? This is the force that a person's blood exerts against the walls of their blood vessels. And this pressure depends upon the resistance of the blood vessels and how hard the heart has to work. So hypertension or high blood pressure is the primary risk factor for cardiovascular disease, including stroke, heart attack, heart failure. So keeping your blood pressure under control is vital for preserving health and reducing the risk of these dangerous conditions. So what exactly is hypertension? So normally speaking, systolic pressure of 110 and a diastolic of 70 is considered to be normal blood pressure. Earlier it was 120/80, but nowadays the textbooks have revised it and they say that 110/70 is normal systolic and diastolic pressure. But yes, as we grow older, there is always a leverage given because there will be a sudden small rise in blood pressure. Blood pressure, which is between 120 and 129 systolic and diastolic, if it remains below 80 also, is termed as pre-hypertensive. That means you are approaching the stage of hypertension. Once your systolic pressure reaches 130 and above, you are in the first stage of hypertension. And the below diastolic pressure is usually 80 and above. Now, the second stage of hypertension is when your systolic pressure goes above 140 and your diastolic pressure goes above 90. 90 and above is termed as second stage hypertension. Now, the third stage of hypertension is called hypertensive crisis, which basically occurs when your systolic pressure goes to 180 and above and your diastolic pressure goes above 120. So that sends the alarm bells ringing, and that is an important factor, which basically means that you need to visit your medical professional immediately. Now, what are the risk factors associated with high blood pressure? So if a person suffers from constant hypertension, and if it is not controlled, and many of us are not even aware that we are hypertensive because there is no specific symptom that we see. Apart from some people who may complain of dizziness or a heaviness in the head area. So this increases the risk for stroke. This can damage the blood vessels in the brain, leading to brain hemorrhage. Now, elevated blood pressure is a major risk factor for cardiac-related concerns. Now, in the eyes also, it can lead to retinal hemorrhage or retinal compression because of the extravasation of blood. In the kidneys, again, high blood pressure narrows and thickens the blood vessels. Because of that, the waste is retained, and through the glomerular, there's a filtration process which happens in the kidneys that gets impacted, and the waste is retained, and this could lead to acute kidney disease and later on chronic kidney disease as well. And there could be a rupture in the small arteries in the kidneys, leading to kidney concern and even eventually kidney failure as well. So hypertension should be taken very seriously. Now, when we talk about the risk factors for hypertension, again, risk factors from a gender-specific concern, it is more common in males than in females, but up till a certain age only. After the age of 65, it can increase in females. So up to the age of 64, it may be less in females, but once a female turns 65, there is an increased number of females who can get hypertensive. Obesity is another risk factor. Truncal obesity specifically is an associated risk factor. Lack of physical activity is a third risk factor which can be associated with increased weight as well. Getting older because of the impact on the arterial walls losing their elasticity. That is again a very, very important factor which we need to keep in mind. It could be familial or genetic as well, when it could run in families. Stress and anxiety is another causative factor for high blood pressure. Elevated sodium intake, high sodium intake, which is in the form of preserved foods, preservatives. If someone is eating such kind of foods on a regular basis, which has a lot of additives, there is a higher possibility of water retention and development of high blood pressure. Again, prolonged use of alcohol, drinking alcohol without moderation can again have an impact on your cardiac health and also lead to elevated blood pressure. Smoking has a direct impact, and so does caffeine as well, because caffeine is usually given to people who have low blood pressure, and it works wonderfully well, specifically when taken in the morning hours. But again, prolonged use of caffeine has had an impact on high blood pressure. And yes, salt intake over a specific amount leads to water retention in the body, and increases your blood pressure as well. Now, what are the symptoms that are associated with high blood pressure? But as I said, not everyone suffers from it. But in severe cases, or when the blood pressure is high, in a very consistent manner, the person may suffer from severe headaches. They could also be nosebleed in some cases. They could be bleeding from the nose if there's a rupture of an artery. There is usually fatigue and confusion. There could be vision problems developing. There could be a feeling of tightness in the chest, not always pain, but there's a tightness that is felt in the chest. There could be irregular heartbeats or pounding in the chest, neck, or ears. There could be blood in the urine also, and there could be trouble breathing as well. And people at times, sometimes feel that other symptoms may be related to high blood pressure, but they may not. At times we have dizziness, we have nervousness, we have sweating, trouble sleeping, we have facial flushing. So these symptoms may not be associated with blood pressure, but at times we get confused. So that is why it is important to get yourself tested on a very, very regular basis. So at least after the age of 50, it is important that you get your blood pressure checked every 3 months. If there is no family history, and if there's a family history of high blood pressure, then monthly checkups is important. Now, how do we manage high blood pressure? So popping the pill is not the answer out here, or not the cure. So looking at your lifestyle is important. So exercising is one of the best things that you can do to lower your high blood pressure. Exercising is a wonderful tool to lower your triglycerides and cholesterol levels also. So regular exercise helps to make your heart stronger, and it makes pumping of blood more efficient, which lowers the pressure in your arteries as well. So about 150 minutes of brisk activity in a week is recommended, which can help lower blood pressure and also lower your cholesterol and triglyceride levels as well. So reducing your sodium intake is important because many studies have linked high salt intake with high blood pressure and heart events, including stroke as well. And drink alcohol in moderation, because drinking alcohol in excess can raise your blood pressure. While again, there has been research which talks about drinking moderate amount of wines can be heart healthy. Now, specifically for people who have cholesterol, small amounts of wine or small amounts of alcohol once or twice a week can cause a process called reverse transfer of cholesterol, wherein the cholesterol from the blood is transferred to the liver, wherein it is broken down. So that can be beneficial for your heart as well, and for your cholesterol and triglyceride levels. But again, going over and overboard with it can have its own side effects. Now, you should look at eating more potassium-rich food. So all the examples that you see, these are foods high in potassium. Probably one very big example is missing is your banana. So because potassium helps your body get rid of sodium, and this eases the pressure on your blood vessels as well. So to get a better balance of potassium to sodium in your diet, focus on eating fewer processed foods and have more fresh and whole foods. This is again quite important. Now, moving on, management of hypertension also looks at managing your stress levels. So we've already talked about stress busting tools, whether it is meditation, whether it is pranayama. You could also look at doing some yoga-based activities. Now, I'm not a yoga specialist, so I specifically requested my yoga colleague to kind of mention some poses. So she was gracious enough to tell about these 3 poses which can be incorporated. But again, on a more broad note, so yoga has multiple benefits, not only on the physical realm, also on the emotional and psychological realm as well. So you could look at incorporating a practice of yoga, maybe if not every day, at least 3 to 4 times a week, and benefit from it as well. And breathing practices, definitely pranayama goes a long way in controlling our thoughts, in reducing stress, and in improving the breathing patterns, which can have an impact in lowering your blood pressure levels also. Other things that you could do for stress management is engaging in hobbies, spending time with your near and dear ones, listening to music. So whatever works for you has to be a part of your daily routine, daily regime, daily lifestyle, which again can be beneficial. I will now quickly talk about these acupressure points. I know I'm running out of time, and I kind of apologized at the start only that this is a very broad subject, so I may overshoot. So when I was talking about blood sugar, I talked about the foot point. So this is the same point that can be stimulated, specifically mental agitation, irritability, which causes a sudden spike in your blood pressure levels, can be brought down by stimulating the liver 3 point. Now there's another point which is present in the base of the neck. So this is called the gallbladder 20 point, which is right at the nape of the neck area. So you can interlock your fingers and keep your thumbs free. Put the palms at the back of your head and stimulate the point, because then the thumbs will directly fall in the nape of the neck area. And then you can look at stimulating the point for 30 to 45 seconds. This is a good point, not only to help bring down the blood pressure, but it is also a good point for headaches which are associated with sudden rise in blood pressure. The third point that you see on the picture is called the forehand point. This basically works at removing stress and anxiety. It helps a person to feel calmer. This is a good point again in premenstrual syndrome, wherein certain females have these emotional upheavals and they feel quite low on energy and as far as emotional energy is concerned. So this point is present about 3-finger breadths from the wrist crease. So this is the wrist crease, and this is 3 fingers from the wrist crease in a groove which is formed within the tendons. So if I make a tight fist, you will notice that the groove becomes prominent. So this point is within the groove. So I'll place my 3 fingers. I'll locate the point within the groove and then apply pressure for about 30 to 45 seconds on one hand and move to the other hand. So we use this point in acupuncture and acupressure for emotional well-being. We use this point for a person to feel calmer. So any kind of stress and anxiety can be brought down by a series of points. And this is one of the points that we use to stimulate. Moving on to the next slide, we have another point which again works on our emotions. It is present on the heart meridian. And this point is again for mental agitation, for anxiety, for nervousness that some people may suffer. And because of that, they have a sudden rise in the blood pressure. So this is again at the wrist crease level. And this is in line with your little finger. So if you look at your little finger and bring the index finger of the other hand down to the edge of your wrist crease, you will feel a bony prominence. Now, next to this bony prominence is a small depression in which this point is present, which is termed as the heart 7 point. Again, once located, apply gentle pressure and stimulate the point for about 30 to 45 seconds. Now, the last point, second last point, is present on the sole. It is called the kidney 1 point. This is present between the second and third toe. So you'll have to locate your second and third toe, and this is about 1/3 from top and 2/3 from bottom of your foot. So from the heel 2/3 and from the junction of the second and third toe, this is 1/3. So this is called the kidney point. This is a very calming point. It helps a person to feel calm. It is also used in sleep concerns. And when you gently press the point of, if someone else stimulates the point for you, you will feel a sense of calmness descending. So combination of all these points work wonderfully well in reducing a certain rise in your blood pressure. And when you do it on a regular basis, your metabolism and your metabolic system gets impacted in a positive manner, and you're able to control your blood pressure in a much more convenient manner. The last point is again a very important point that we use in high blood pressure. This is called the top of the head point, but you cannot just randomly locate the point. You'll have to locate the apex of your ears first, and this point is right, in relationship in line with the apex of the ears. And as you bring your fingers back, this is in line with your apex, and once you've located the point, this is the highest point, and you apply pressure digitally with your thumb and stimulate the point for about 30 to 45 seconds at the most. So all these points, when you stimulate, you spend about 5 to 6 minutes in stimulating the point. And this goes a long way in kind of maintaining the metabolic balance that you're looking at. Now we'll quickly, wrap up the session with a brief talk on managing our brain health, because this is something which is quite important as we grow older. Because it has been seen that as we age, our mental faculties start to diminish. So chances of developing concerns like dementia, concerns like Alzheimer's is basically on the rise now. So by identifying and controlling the risk factors and making simple but effective lifestyle changes, you can maximize your chances of lifelong brain health and preserve your cognitive abilities for a longer duration of time. So there are 7 basic pillars on which brain health stands. So the first one is regular exercise. So we've talked about the benefit of exercising as far as your cardiac health is concerned, as far as your sugar health, diabetes is concerned, as far as your hypertension is concerned. Same goes for your brain health also. There has been a research which was done which indicated that people who exercise regularly, they reduce the risk of development of dementia or probably a condition like Alzheimer's by about 50%. And exercise can also slow further deterioration in those who have already started to develop cognitive problems. So exercise protects against Alzheimer's and other types of dementia by stimulating the brain's ability to maintain old connections as well as to make new ones. So again, the concept of 150 minutes of activity in a week holds good out here as well. Now, build muscle also to pump up your brain. So moderate level of weight and resistance training not only increases muscle mass, it also helps to maintain your brain health. Specifically for those over 65, you could look at having at least a couple of sessions of strength training on a weekly basis to enhance your cognitive abilities. And you could also look at developing, practicing some balancing and coordination exercises to stay agile. Like you could practice Tai Chi, or you could use balancing activities in yoga also, which can again help in improving your cognition ability. Second is social engagement. Second important pillar is social engagement, which basically means that human beings, we are very, social creatures. We do not thrive in isolation, and neither does our brain. So staying socially engaged can even protect symptoms of dementia developing. So it is important to maintain a good social network, so invest time in friends and family. The third important pillar is a healthy diet. Because in dementia, inflammation and insulin resistance, these injure the neurons or the nerve cells and inhibit communication between the brain cells. So Alzheimer's is sometimes described as diabetes of the brain as well. And a growing body of research suggests a strong link between metabolic disorders and the signal processing systems. So by adjusting your eating habits, you can help reduce inflammation and protect your brain as well. So you should look at managing your weight so that you do not develop overweight in midlife. You should look at cutting down on sugar because sugar leads to inflammation. You should look at getting plenty of omega-3 in your diet. And omega-3 is a very rich source. If you're a vegetarian, then you can look at seed rotation. You can have different types of seeds on a regular basis. It could be chia seeds on one day, a teaspoon. It could be flax seeds the other day. It could be a tablespoon of pumpkin seeds. You could have some soaked almonds. You could have a soaked walnut on the next day, and so on and so forth. And this will give you the amount of omega-3 that you need. And if you're a non-vegetarian, you can look at having fish and fish oil as well. Apart from this, you could again focus on more of fruits and vegetables in your diet, because they help to increase the antioxidant levels, provide you with the vitamins that you need. The next important pillar is mental stimulation, which basically means that you should continue to learn new things and challenge your brain throughout life. So when you're looking to prevent the onset of dementia, then it becomes, when it comes to your brain, the key is to keep on using your brain. So you should look at learning something new. It could be a new, instrument, a new hobby that you develop, a new language, a new set of skill sets that you can look at incorporating and developing. Similarly, you could look at enjoying puzzles and riddles, brain teasers, playing board games, cards, playing the Scrabble or solving the Sudoku. So all these help a lot in improving cognition. Similarly, improving the quality of sleep is important because there is a direct link between poor sleep and the development of dementia. So we've already talked about the importance of sleep in the first topic. So I'm not going to repeat that. So establishing a regular sleep schedule, keeping your mind calm, all these are important aspects. Stress management is again something that we've already talked about. So it's beneficial even for the mental cognition concerns that you keep your stress levels under control. Keeping a sense of humor is important. So ability to laugh at yourself is important, because the act of laughing helps your body fight stress as well. And finally, the importance of vascular health. So there's more and more evidence to indicate that what is good for your heart is also good for your brain. So maintain your cardiovascular health, and that can be crucial in protecting your brain also, and lowering the risk of developing dementia and conditions like Alzheimer's or vascular dementia later on in life. So these were important aspects that can help in improving your brain health also. So thank you so much for being a part of this talk. I'm sorry we did overshoot, but yes, I'm willing to extend to answer the questions that they might be in the chat box. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ayush. It was actually a very nice session and very informative, I must say.
Thank you.
Many questions which are there in the Q&A as well as am I audible?
Well, your voice did go away for a small few seconds.
Okay, now it's fine.
Yes, now it's better.
So the first question which has come up is, so when we say frequent urination, what is the normal and what is alarming? What frequency would we say as?
Okay, so now firstly we need to understand that with the normal aging process, the control over the muscles in the bladder area, it starts to reduce. So there is actually a small increase in urination, and in elderly males, there is this concern of prostate enlargement also, which could be a contributing factor to increase urination. So we have to first look at those aspects as well. So we need to have a very open mindset out here to understand that the frequency of urination could be due to different reasons in different people. But otherwise, in a very general, healthy adult male or female, elderly adult male or female, getting up once or twice at night and going to pass urine is perfectly normal. And going about 3 to 4 times in a day is also very normal. So up to 6 to 7 times is perfectly fine. It could be 8 times also. The alarming signs come when probably the person goes and urinates multiple times at night, maybe 6, 7 times at night. And in the daytime also, the person goes about 10 to 12 times. So you can imagine that, in every half an hour, the person is going and urinating, or probably getting up continuously at night and going and urinating, which can impact the sleep also. So those are alarming signs and need to be, investigated. What is the causative factor which could be associated with it? Yep. Can we move on to the next question, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ayush. So
Yep.
The next question is from Mr. Mohammad Rafi, and his father has a total cholesterol 301, triglycerides.
I couldn't get you. Total cholesterol of
301.
201, 201.
301.
301. Okay,
yeah.
Right.
Triglycerides at 158.
Mm-hmm.
HDL 43 and LDL 226.
Okay.
So he's asking about the changes that he needs to make in his lifestyle of food.
Right. So firstly, so the total cholesterol should be brought down to less than 200. It is 301. The HDL cholesterol is actually fine. I mean, it should be more than 40. His father is 43. Triglycerides also borderline. It should be less than 150. It is 158. And LDL, I believe, is mentioned as 200. So this is a cause for concern, because higher levels of LDL have a direct impact on your cardiovascular system. So ensuring that I'm not sure, I mean, what his father does, I mean, probably, but the things that we've talked about today. So see, cholesterol levels can be brought down significantly by looking at your physical activity levels. So if a person is physically active and does about 20 to 25 minutes of cardio-based activities on a daily basis, and that depends upon the person's individual capacity, you see. A 30-year-old or 40-year-old's capacity would be different from a 70-year-old's. So from an age perspective, whatever is more suitable, that kind of an activity is advocated and recommended and should be done if the person is otherwise healthy to move around. So he should be encouraged to kind of work on their overall metabolism. So that is number one. Number two is, from a dietary perspective, care should be taken that packaged foods which are easily available over the counter, such kind of food products should be minimized. There should be more focus on healthy vegetables, green leafy vegetables, fruits as part of the dietary protocol. If you are a non-vegetarian, then look at reducing the amount of red meat that you eat or processed meat that you may be consuming. Look at probably chicken or fish for that matter. And even if you like your eggs, have the egg white also. So make changes in your diet, make changes in your physical activity, and in more cases than not, your cholesterol levels will start to respond, and these will start coming down. If it does not, then obviously you have to have medications also. So there are medications available. Modern medicine has a lot of statins which are advocated, and otherwise also in complementary therapies also there are very good medicines available. So depending upon what your inclination is, you can look at medicinal support as well. But only medicinal support may not work. So some amount of physical activity and proper dietary habits have to be incorporated. So you can look for answers there and see what you can do.
Thank you. The next question is about the symptoms of diabetes, and Sandeep is asking whether varicose vein could be a symptom for diabetes.
Not necessarily. Varicose veins can happen otherwise also. They are not usually associated only with diabetes. It could be lack of musculature. Basically, it's a lack of elasticity in the blood vessels, which leads to varicosities developing. It could be in some people it is because of their lifestyle. It is about their profession. So people who stand long hours, working. So people who are in a profession wherein they have to stand for long hours, like teachers, like people who, people like traffic police, people who actually spend about 7 to 8 hours, 10 hours in a day just standing and delivering. So because of increased blood flow into the lower extremities, and as we grow older, the veins they lose elasticity, and because of that, varicose veins develops. So varicose veins can happen otherwise also, and they are not directly related with blood sugar or diabetes.
So, doctor, in the diabetes part, you had mentioned a couple of herbal things like the jamun and all. The question is about their common name. Like jamun is understandable, but there was one Cephalendra indica or a couple of more.
Yeah.
So if the common names for those could be told to people.
Okay, now, unfortunately, jamun was the only fruit out there that you could eat, right? The medicine is basically made from the seed, actually. When we make the medicine, it is made from the seed. Similarly, Cephalendra indica and Helonius, these are flowering plants, and different parts are used in preparing remedies. They're not taken orally. You cannot probably take a Cephalendra leaf and chew upon it. It may have toxic effects. So then basically it's a medicinal plant from which the medicine is prepared, basically. So Cephalendra, Helonius, these are two medicinal plants from which the medicine is extracted, and the homeopathic mother tincture is made, which is then kind of dispensed. But as far as jamun is concerned, both the medicine can be made, and you can have jamun as a fruit also. I hope I was able to make that clear.
Sure, that was actually a needed thing. Otherwise, people try and self-medicate. That is something which was needed. So, doctor, there are a couple of questions on the acupressure points that you have shown, and I would like to club them. So the questions are majorly on whether it can be done daily, and if it is to be done daily, how many times a day, and could there be any ill effects if not done properly?
Right. So I'll first try and answer all the parts together. So see, from a more optimal perspective, these can be done on a daily basis. So it is all about spending those 5 to 10 minutes with yourself. So there's a specific advantage of doing these acupressure points. Firstly, you get your own time. You're not you're doing something for your own well-being. So you'll be focused upon your internal energy, and you will be trying to stimulate that energy flow. So firstly, you can control the thought processes as well. So you can combine that with a bit of breathing practices and stimulate the points, so that you don't have to do these activities separately and take a lot of your time. So if you can kind of devote 5 to 6 minutes in the daytime and 5 to 6 minutes at night time, so a couple of times a day is perfectly fine. You could look at doing it 3 to 4 times also, but that depends upon the severity of your complaints. what is the nature of your concern. So ideally speaking, a couple of times in a day is good enough. But otherwise, if you're having a specific concerns, you could do it 3 or 4 times also and see the response. The third part is whether if I don't do it correctly, will there be any side effect? Now, see, when we talk about acupressure, you will notice that we are using our thumb and our index finger. The surface area is very broad. Okay, so, but if I was using a needle, like in acupuncture, I would have to be very precise so that I needle the exact point. For example, if I talk about the heart 7 point out here, which I mentioned. So from a needle perspective, I have to needle it right in the exact location because the tip of the needle has a very small diameter. If I do it, a few millimeters on the right or few millimeters on the left, I will not get the impact that I would have wanted. And at times, obviously, needle is an invasive technique. If I do it wrongly, if I kind of pierce a bone or probably puncture a vein, there could be complications developing. But in acupressure, you are actually using your thumb and index finger. It is non-invasive. So even if you are not totally correct about the location of the point, but even if you stimulate it, a bit right or a bit on the left, there is a higher possibility of you still touching the specific point and stimulating it and getting benefit. And there is no side effect of stimulating the acupressure points. But it is all about stimulating the flow of energy in the body. That is what you're doing. And that is what you want to achieve. So in short, there is no side effects of stimulating the acupressure points. And even if you're off point, you probably end up stimulating some other point, but not that the point for that particular concern. You really don't harm yourself in acupressure.
Right. Thank you, Doctor. I'm aware that we have overshot the time. Just last 2 questions that we would address. So it is about the diet. Like there are 2 theories that are very prevalent nowadays, that you can eat only 2 times a day, or you can have food every 3 to 4 hours. So which is better and good for weight loss or general health, from a general health perspective?
See, again, there is no one size fits all. Now, both the theories have their own positives. People who probably look at who want to control their weight, it is always advisable to kind of incorporate intermittent fasting, which basically means that having a gap of at least 16 hours between a 2 set of meals. So if you have had your dinner at 8 o'clock, so the next day have your breakfast only at 12. And you can do this a couple of times a week. So that is one, intermittent fasting, which basically means that you have 2 meals in a day. The second theory is, second part to this theory is that if you're probably having 2 meals in a day, and if you want to work on your metabolism, that's a better approach if you are having a sedentary lifestyle. So if your lifestyle is not very active, you should still look at increasing the activity, but you can look at having 2 wholesome meals and giving your body a better chance to kind of up the metabolism. Now the other picture comes now, having smaller meals at regular intervals. Now, some people, they need more of energy because of the nature of their work. So in such cases, or probably the age in which they are. Similarly, for example, if you're a working adult, if you are quite physically active, then the recommendation would be to have smaller meals at regular intervals, if that is possible in your daily schedule. So that would provide you the energy, and you would not be kind of feeling bereft of energy, which would cause you to crash. So again, there is no one specific approach depending upon your body type also. Now, when I talk about body types, there are multiple theories again out here. So if you talk in terms of Ayurveda, there is the Vata body type, there's a Pitta body type, there's a Kapha body type. In general science, there's a mesomorphic body type, endomorph, ectomorph body type. So there are different body types also, and based on that also, the nutritionists who are more into nutrition, they kind of devise what will be the ideal way in which you would want to achieve your well-being goals. So probably I was able to probably give you a part of this answer. Probably I'll not be able to give you in great depth because nutrition is not my forte. But yes, I would be able to kind of give you an understanding of how these things work.
Thank you, Doctor. I think this answer was quite helpful. So I think we can wind up here, and I thank you and Roundglass as well for helping me arrange this session. Thank you, Doctor. It was a really wonderful session, and I am sure everyone would have a takeaway, like you mentioned, from this session.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Shweta.
The participants, if there are any queries, you can please connect with us. We'll be more than happy to address them later as well. On behalf of Global Insurance Brokers, I would like to thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Namaste. Namaste.